The fear of things can be forgivable. Most of us have instincts to flee towards protection when we encounter something that seems terrifying. It's a human reaction that is natural and understandable. So when the pandemic began in March of 2020, it was completely within the boundaries of human behavior to fear what might be coming. Media and government were all saying that this had the potential to destroy entire civilizations, and that if we didn't act in the most dramatic of fashions, we or someone we loved would likely fall victim to this dastardly virus. Most people are willing to be reasonable. That actually is a hallmark of a world that has been oriented to liberty since the Enlightenment. Wars are not desired by most civilized people, only their governments. Countries and their people have a bent towards being understanding and compassionate. So even when government distrust was at an all-time high prior to COVID, people saw it as their responsibility to be kind and caring of the vulnerable, and they soldiered on into isolation, hoping that they would have more understanding and data about what this loosed virus was capable of. Governments around the world spoke of a short-term phase that would be over before we knew it, and it would give healthcare workers the chance to deal with the onslaught that was inevitably around the corner. But soon, we found out that this virus wasn't everything that we had been sold on. Its impact was real, and people did die from it, but the piles of bodies that they had promised never materialized. In logic, there is something called a causal fallacy, where equivalent ideas are compared that have nothing to do with one another. COVID showed government's capacity at this trait better than anything we had seen in modern history. The argument stated that people didn't die because we did actions that had no scientific proof or connection to reality. So we would wear masks in our cars driving alone, or walk through a restaurant to a table, then sit down and take our masks off, because everyone knows that viruses only hang out above booth level. Millions were convinced to take an experimental shot masquerading as a vaccine that has untold damage and side effects upon the populace. The irrationality that was presented as the right way of behavior was silly and comical under normal circumstances. But because there had been an appeal to authority, which is another logical fallacy, people complied without question and altered their entire orientation to behaviors. For some, that tendency towards those actions still linger on, and with the slightest hint by media that the smart people will all dutifully comply with the next new mandates or masking, they find their old stash of masks and march out into the public to virtue signal their wisdom. All of this manipulation has had tremendous consequence on our world. Governments used this baseline fear in people to advance agendas that were only dreamed of by the most totalitarian regimes from history. The fear of death and sickness was leveraged in such a fashion that they were able to consolidate businesses and property and monies and concentrate it into the most powerful corporate interests. They could change the way elections were done. They could print money and siphon it into the system via Wall Street and close down the shops on Main Street without any due process or adherence to constitutionally required compensation. We were forced into an eminent domain world where governments acted on behalf of their major donors to squash their competition and make sure that they had all the funding they needed to profit excessively. And they did it all without ever firing a shot. The programs that they provided in PPP or ERC were free money to the well-connected and wealthy. They placed small business in a moral hazard. Take the money, because if we shut you down further, you'll be responsible for your employees. Small business was forced into a shotgun wedding to either comply with this graft or face ruination. Ultimately, that money was unaccounted for and was significantly more than any one world can sustain. Printing money has always been consequential to communities. From the smallest forms of government to the large globalist amalgamations we find ourselves in today, when government prints money, in whatever form they wish to disguise it in, the consequence is a hidden tax upon the poor and middle class. The difference this time around is that the money isn't physical. We don't see it in front of our eyes any longer, in the form of bills. So much of this is done in the ledgers of computers that no one actually sees the degradation that is happening to the money. In the past, when you had to take gunny sacks of money to buy bread, you were aware of the crime that had been committed. In our system today, you only see the numbers in an account, and we glance past banks with billions of dollars on their balance sheets because it isn't tangible. The true reality of the money supply is completely unknown. Our fractional reserve lending system allows for banks to generate their own money in lending to the tune of 90% or more on every transaction. This is hard to understand, and when it's laid out, it feels like a crime. An example, a bank can take your hard-earned wages, let's call it $1,000, and can lend out that money to someone else to the tune of 90%, or $900. But your ledger still has all the money in it. But 900 new dollars were created out of thin air. That person takes their $900 and buys something with it. The vendor, who charged them for it, puts it in their bank, showing their ledger as $900. That bank can then lend out 90% of that, or $810. So now there's $2,710 in existence, all off that initial $1,000 deposit, just in 2 transactions. Repeat this until the money is gone, and there are tens of thousands of dollars in existence, all off of a $1,000 deposit. It's completely legal and encouraged, but it also means that the actual known dollars in our system is totally unobtainable. We could never ascertain how much our money is worth, because there's no inventory of the supply other than the debt that we are allowed to see. So back to COVID. What is unimaginable at this point is that nearly $8 trillion was flooded into the system to help protect the American economy by the federal government, and countless other trillions around the world by their governments to protect their systems. That money is all lendable in the same fractional manner as our previous example. And soon enough, your currency is less valuable than the toilet paper that everyone raced out to buy at the start of the pandemic. Without any accountability or physical awareness of how much money is in the system, we just feel poorer. Milk and gas and eggs are suddenly unaffordable for the average person. Wages are always lagging in this system, so it squeezes people until they break. Houses become out of reach for the average person working because the dirty secret is that the home did not become more valuable. It's that your money became more worthless. Housing is the only real indicator in this cloudy system of what is actually going on. So is it any surprise that the largest corporations on Wall Street made a direct play at ownership of these assets? Housing prices should not grow to nearly double in a 2-year period. But that is exactly what happened from 2019 to 2021. It happened because the zone was flooded with trillions of dollars and leveraging was cheap. One could take those millions that were obtained as a corporation to help their employees and buy assets instead. And it could all be done on the cheap with leveraged money from the bank that they had created out of thin air on their ledgers. So millions turned into billions of assets that companies could pay any price for because tomorrow it would be worth more. The banksters know the game, and they understood that the printing of so-called money was devaluing the currency. The wise dumped their earnings and government graft into assets so that it would at least hold par with what their income was actually worth. It feels rigged to the average American. It is falsely called capitalism, when in actuality it is what Robert Kennedy Jr. describes as a cushy socialism for the wealthy and well-connected, and a brutal capitalism for the poor and middle class. When it all crashes, which it will, they will send in regulators to make an example of a few poor schmucks that are on the outs with the Washington elites or the billionaires club, and it will feel like something will change. But it will soon be back to the Wild West poker table, where the dealer is always the winner, and the government house will get their cut to help maintain the crooked rules. Without a dismantling of the cronyism and fascist economic system, the free market will continue to be at the mercy of the money supply and the ones who control it. If the powerful can control the supply of money, they can control us, the people. We will be subjected to a subtle slavery for meager wages that never allow for innovation and advancement. We need new thinking on this, and it must be less centralized than the current iteration. Americans don't realize that they live in an oligarchic system that is just as cruel and demoralizing as the communist states of history or the present. People need to have the opportunity to trade freely and establish their own value of assets instead of it being handed over to the central planning experts. There is very little separation from the Soviet-style system of monetary management and the Federal Reserve. A fancy name with alliteration of freedom and federalism does not a free market make. This has to change, or we are destined for subsistence and poverty at the hands of a few.